2 p.m. Eastern, President Trump will make a major announcement on the nation's opioid epidemic.
Mr. Trump is expected to declare the opioid crisis a public health emergency, as opposed to a more sweeping national state of emergency. Here's what he had to say in an interview last night about it.
Next week, I'm going to be declaring an emergency, a national emergency on drugs. The opioid is a tremendous emergency. What's going on there? The drugs pouring into the country have gotten, and I tell you what, we've made a big impact, but still, we need the wall. You know, part of the reason we need the wall is for drugs.
Well, let's bring in Kalen Borchers. He's a political reporter for The Fix at The Washington Post, and he joins us now from D.C. So, Kalen, we know the president had considered declaring a national emergency on opioids, but instead he's now expected to declare the opioid crisis a public health emergency. Walk us through the difference.
Well, they're similar in the sense that both sort of deregulate some of the restrictions on how money can be spent. So, for example, as a public health emergency now, some money going to states that would have been allocated ordinarily for, say, HIV or diabetes can be shifted to address opioids. The key difference, though, is the timeline. So while a national emergency is sort of an indefinite declaration, a public health emergency lasts for only 90 days. And now it can be renewed. But what this means is that the president is going to have to revisit this issue again in January. And typically a public health emergency is for an acute temporary situation. You might remember H1N1 several years ago. The Obama administration declared that a public health emergency, with the sense being we got to get this under control, but it's not going to last a very long time. One could certainly argue that the opioid epidemic is a little bit more long-term than just 90 days.
So in that sound that we played, the president also linked the need for a border wall to the drug crisis. This is something that we've heard him say before. Do you expect him to sort of continue with that case? I don't know if the two types of drug crises are actually linked, but...
Yeah, well, I think what this is, though, is part of his argument that there's only so much that we can do to address the opioid epidemic through deregulation or by throwing money at it. I mean, his argument is that at its root, the biggest problem here is drugs, I should say, flowing into this country over the border from Mexico, and he's using that to make his case for the border wall. And of course, it's much more complicated than that. There's problems, for example, of drugs perhaps being overprescribed or leftover unused prescriptions being sold on sort of a black market, I guess you could call it. I mean, it's not all about narcotics flowing across the border either.
Kalen, as you know, this opioid announcement comes as the president is continuing his push on tax reform. Yesterday, we heard him say there is great unity in the party, despite that intense criticism from Senators Corker and Flake earlier this week. What are you hearing about how all that conflict is impacting this push on taxes?
Yeah, I mean, he's right in a very basic sense, which is that Republicans, virtually all Republicans, can agree on the basic principle of lower taxes. But how you get there, what exactly that looks like, there is not so much agreement. And, of course, one of the big ones that has come up this week is what do you do about the tax deduction for 401k savings? That's something the president says that he wants to not touch, but he seems to also indicate that it could be a bargaining chip. And so he has not said that it's completely off the table. And that's just one example of the kind of thing that could be a sticking point for Republicans. They don't necessarily need any Democrats to get on board with this. The president has said he's hoping to get some Democrats on board with his tax plan. But assuming that's not the case, we're in the same position that we were with repealing and replacing the Affordable Care Act, right, where you can only lose 2 Republican votes. So the margin of error is very, very narrow here. And again, this will be a test of whether Mitch McConnell can get his entire caucus together and on the same page.
All right, before we let you go, we have to talk to you about a piece that you wrote about a comment that the president made yesterday. And he was talking about the way the media depicts him. So let's listen to what he had to say. Then we'll talk on the other side.
Well, I think the press makes me more uncivil than I am. You know, people don't understand. I went to an Ivy League college. I was a nice student. I did very well. I'm a very intelligent person. The fact is, I really believe the press creates a different image of Donald Trump than the real person.
Okay, so it's us. It's not what he's saying. It's the way we're depicting what he's saying. And the proof is that he went to an Ivy League college. Your reaction?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack here. One that stands out to me is that this is a president who prides himself on circumventing the media and using Twitter to speak directly to people. And of course, as we all can observe on Twitter, that's when he is at his most uncivil at times. He regularly throws insults on Twitter, and it would be impossible to blame the media for creating that image when that is coming directly from his own thumbs tapping on his iPhone. The other thing that stands out to me, though, of course, is that he's really not talking about the same character trait, right? And when asked, he doesn't say, I am civil or I am a kind person. What he says is, I'm an intelligent person and I'm well educated. I went to Penn. Those are not the same thing. And the thing that strikes me there is that it's a logic that probably would rankle many in his base. Keep in mind that 69% of Trump voters in the general election don't have a degree from any college, never mind an Ivy League institution. And so I don't think those people would agree that going to Penn or any other Ivy League school makes you a nice person. So it was striking to me to see him make an argument that probably doesn't resonate with his own base.
But he's made that argument
He's made it
before.
so many times,
yeah.
Caleb. And Anne-Marie and I were listening to him deliver that speech in front of voters in Alabama,
right.
Where he himself seemed to be surprised. I don't think he was surprised. I think he kind of knows in a cynical fashion that it is remarkable that the people of Alabama, he said, support him, even though he lives in a beautiful apartment on Fifth Avenue,
yes.
and he has the best of everything. And he seems to recognize that it's in a way strange that the folks that you're talking about who support him would actually continue to support him, knowing all the things that they know about him, including now the fact that he went to an Ivy League school.
Right. I mean, that is one of the great wonders of Donald Trump, is that he became a champion for the everyman when it's not just that he's wealthy and successful now, but that he came from wealth and privilege. So he really can't relate on a personal level to working class blue collar voters, and yet they consider him to be an advocate for them. So that is one of his most impressive political feats. There's no question. But I think you saw it yesterday when he said, people don't understand. I went to an Ivy League institution. If they don't understand that he went to Penn, it may be because he actually doesn't talk about it all that often relative to other praise. I mean, he mentions it occasionally, but a president who spends a lot of time talking himself up sort of glosses over that in some ways. He talks about his wealth and his success, but I think he understands that for a lot of voters in Alabama, for example, being an Ivy League elite is perhaps not a plus, and it's not something that he always highlights. But it was where he reached yesterday when asked about his civility.
And I recall, Callum, Senator Rick Santorum, he'd already left office, but he once remarked, because President Obama was suggesting college was important, that he suggested that President Obama was a snob.
Yes, how elitist.
How elitist, how elitist. And now the President of the United States is touting his Penn credentials, and that's a good thing.
It's a different world.
It's a different world we're living in, Callum.
In many ways.
Callum Borchers of the Washington Post, as always, my friend, thank you.
Glad to be with you.